Hello everybody, my pizza was cooling off. So with this, I should say podcast or voice recording, I want to bring up the good old subject matter of sexual gender, right? Okay, so I'm going to bring up a couple examples that I know a lot of die-hard horror fans are going to be like, how dare you? But it's good that we talk about these things. Okay. So, it kind of pegs the question of, does a solid villain that has a lot of layers, does gender really matter? Does a villain have to be masculine or feminine? Does gender really matter? Because if you think about the concept of gender, right? Concept of gender is DNA, it's genetics, it's chromosomes. It's a part of who we are. And a lot of times, we kind of do the old school method of things, especially, when a baby's born, right? We be like, oh, well, this baby's a boy. Oh, but this baby's a girl. Gender. But that's what gender says. But that's the law of nature. That's what gender says, okay? But once again, really gender, what is gender? Gender really comes down to chromosomes, comes down to biology, comes down to science, comes down to DNA. And, you know, that there are so many genders that people go by, whether it's bisexual, whether it's transgender, whether it's pansexual, whether it's lesbian, whether it's gay. There are so many genders, sexual genders, that an individual goes by. And there are so many genders between what we think as feminine and what we think as masculine. Because that is what people say, oh, well, that's just the natural law of things. Okay. And it kind of goes back to the concept of a villain, right? Can a villain that has a lot of layers, let's say Freddy Krueger, does that villain have to be per se masculine? Does that villain essentially have to be a dude in order to make that villain work within pop culture and to work within the norms of society? Not really. Not really. Not really, because not all amazing villains have to be dudes. There are some amazing villains out there that are women, that are female, that are just as deadly and just as calculated and just as skilled and just as powerful as Freddy on a lot of levels than one. So yeah, I think as a writer who is a horror nerd that, you know, is a fan of Wes Craven, that we need to kind of step beyond the rules of gender, that we shouldn't really care and get so hung up about, oh, well, a solid villain that kills people and chases teenagers in their sleep has to be a dude. And also how, the people say like, oh, women cannot be villains. Women are too weak. They're easy prey. They're too weak. There's no way a solid character there's no way a woman can be as powerful as Freddy. How do you know? Example. Women UFC fighters, right? Female UFC fighters. Holy shit. They are fucking intimidating. Because let me tell you something. UFC female fighters have trained ever since they were little. They have spent years training Years training. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how buff of a guy you are. It doesn't matter how many hours in the gym that you've been at. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how long that you look at your glorious body while, being all buff in the gym. If you get in the ring with a heavyweight, multi-championed female UFC fighter, that female UFC fighter will knock you down in less than 30 seconds. Will kick your ass in less than 30 seconds. Because it's all about how skilled she is. It's all about the technique that goes into UFC fighting that these female UFC fighters have trained their whole lives for. And they're damn good at it. So that goes back to the concept of gender when it comes to villains, right? Does a villain necessarily have to be male in order to make it work? No. And it kind of brings up the concept of Jaslyn for Broken Angel Thriller novel project that I am still working on. It's getting close. It's getting close to self-published. Promise, y'all. But it kind of brings up that concept of Jaslyn, right? Where Jaslyn is this very dominant figure. Jaslyn in a lot of ways is territorial, dominant, calculated, skilled, kind of like a shark, but at the same time is manipulative. But at the same time has a very dark sense of humor. Then it's that whole thing of Jaslyn taking over Jamie's soul and kind of putting Jamie in this state of limbo and making her do things that she normally would never do. Kind of, in a way, wiggling, that Jaslyn is kind of, the character is kind of wiggling the fingers inside Jamie's head, inside of her soul, and using her madness and using the shattered pieces of who she is and fucking with it. Right? So then it kind of begs the question of, okay, if Jaslyn, this character, darker part of Jamie, even though you find out there's more to Jaslyn's origin story of who Jaslyn is, but just for the time being, since Jaslyn, the character, identifies as being more dominant, but yet being on the lines of masculine, and that when Jaslyn does take over Jamie's soul, okay, well then, does Jamie identify as being female? Or is there a conflict of gender with these two characters that are completely opposite of each other, but yet at the same time correlate with each other so well, because you have Jaslyn, who is this very territorial, very dominant, on the borderlines of being masculine, but is skilled and is calculated, and a lot of different layers to this Jaslyn character. And then you have Jamie, who is terrified, who is scared, who is broken, who is damaged, who is shattered beyond repair. So then really, when it comes to the whole relationship with Jaslyn and Jamie, Jaslyn is the one who is the stronger, the supreme being of them two. Where Jamie is the weakling, and Jaslyn is the dominant. I'm gonna fuck you up. Oh, I'm gonna take a fork and stab it in your throat. Or, you know what? I'm just gonna use my bare teeth and rip a chunk of your tongue out of your mouth. Like dominance. Just so then it kind of also begs the question too of, okay, well, with that whole concept of gender when it comes to Jaslyn, if Jaslyn were to face Freddy, who would be the more dominant one? Who would be the more territorial one? Who would be the more calculated one? Who would be the more dominant one even on the lines of masculine? Would it be Jaslyn or would it be Freddy? Who would be more powerful? And like I said, when it comes to a solid villain with multiple layers that actually work, especially in a horror movie, does sex and gender of the old school way of how people see sex and gender, does that really matter? Or can there be a villain that can have qualities of both, that can still be very much feminine, but then at the same time can be very dominant, can be very territorial, can be on the borderlines of masculine, and be just as calculated and be just as scary as Freddy? Is possible. And I know a lot of die-hard horror fans were like, yeah, but Freddy's a guy, but Freddy goes after women and females. That's his shtick. That's what he does. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. No, that's not a bad thing. There's good things about that, but I would like to see more horror movies going forward that push the boundaries of gender, that push that boundaries of the old school way of how we see gender, how we see sex, how we view it, and go beyond that, but do it in a right way, where gender does not matter, where you can have a female villain that has this dominant, territorial, even masculine personality to the villain that can be just as scary and be just as terrifying and be just as calculated as Freddy Krueger or as Michael Myers or that whole thing. Do you know how fucking badass that would be? Do you know how, like, mind-boggling amazing that would be? That would open doors in so many different ways. It would be so cool. And that's what we need. Instead of going back to the old way of how, okay, if we're, okay, people, example, people in a writer's room, right? So we're going to make a villain. Villain's going to be scary. You know, villain's going to chase people. But the villain has to be male, okay? Because, you know, male testosterone, dominance. Ugh. Okay? And then they got to chase people around with a machete. So that's cool, right? Where I would be the one in the writer's room, I'm like, so can we bring up the subject matter of sex and gender, please? Why? Why does sex and gender matter? I have a different viewpoint of sex and gender. I mean, that's cool and that's amazing that you want to do like the old school method of things. And I am a big fan of 1980s pop culture horror movies. But don't you think that we should push the boundaries and push the envelope of sex and gender? Because there are a lot of people that have a lot of different sexual identities, you know, with bisexual, transgender, gender fluid, lesbian, gay, pansexual, just to name a few, but there is a lot. So maybe we could, I don't know, make a villain just as terrifying and just as scary as you want, but then be a little bit more open to sex and gender to reach a further audience, to make them feel more included, rather than just going to the old shtick and throwing the old bone of horror movies. And then I get the evil glares from people like, how dare you bring up sex and gender in this room? This does not matter. Like, you know what? Okay. Sure, fine, whatever. But that's just my whole concept, is really, when it comes to a villain, sex and gender really shouldn't matter, and it shouldn't be something that somebody is so hung up on that we should go beyond the norms of what sex and gender is, and that there are plenty of female villains out there that I think we don't have enough of them that could be just as calculated and be just as scary as Freddy Krueger or Michael Myers, or, right? And that kind of, even though I'm not a big Tiffany fan from Chucky, don't hate me, even though I'm not a big Tiffany fan from Chucky, or I'm not a big, Harley Quinn fan, in retrospect, I can still respect the villainous concept of Harley or Tiffany or Poison Ivy, where they're still villains, but they still are deadly in their own way, and they still can kick ass. So it is possible. It is possible to have villains be female, or if that's what they identify as female, that can be just as skilled and just as deadly as Freddy Krueger, even though Freddy Krueger's a dude. It's possible. It's possible. Henceforth, that brings up the concept of Jaslyn, where Jaslyn is this very dominant figure that takes over Jamie's soul, where Jamie is very weak and very scared and very terrified, and Jaslyn sees Jamie's weakness and uses that and just cuts it up into pieces and just does not care. So, I mean, this is my concept. But yeah, that's kind of my viewpoint of sex and gender, especially when it comes to horror movies and all that stuff. So, and it kind of also goes back to the concept of Jaslyn, a Broken Angel thriller novel project, and really where sex and gender, because of Jaslyn's true origin and who Jaslyn really is, as you find out later in Broken Angel thriller novel project, that really sex and gender does not matter. That sex and gender does not faze Jaslyn at all. Does not matter to Jaslyn whatsoever. Sex and gender really doesn't matter when it comes to the character of Jaslyn and Jaslyn's personality. So, there you go. That's my, my shtick. And yeah, I am a big 1980s pop culture horror fan, and Nightmare on Elm Street has the classic Nightmare on Elm Street 1980s movies have inspired me, and especially writing dream scenes and the very, very terrifying nightmares that Jamie goes through. Even though I'm not going to bitch and I'm not going to rant about my issues with the 2010 remake that we do not talk about because it is forbidden to talk about, because it's oh god, I need a bottle of whiskey to even talk about that thing. Go through a bottle of whiskey, y'all. But that's my concept of how I view sex and gender when it comes to horror movies. I'm a very open-minded person when it comes to this stuff, so yeah. Alright, cool. I shall post this on YouTube. Alright, see you.